Hey friend, listen. I know the world is scary right now. Corruption, war, inflation, demographics, degeneracy, disease, unrest, hatred, and despair. We didn't come here to tell you how it is, but that it's going to get way better.
Got a good thing coming, and it's all I need. Everything I wanted, so wait and see.
Better by Bitcoin. Hey, welcome. So back in the show, today we wanted to talk about Bitcoin and Christianity. More specifically, we wanted to talk about Thank God for Bitcoin organization and the Orange Umbrella, which is a new book that this organization, Thank God for Bitcoin, is going to be putting out in the wild for everybody. And on the show today, we have the illustrious Jordan Bush. He's been around Bitcoin for a while. He is a pivotal key mover in the space, if you will, especially with regard to Bitcoin and Christianity. Jordan, welcome to the show. You've been on the show before, obviously, and great to have you back.
Great to have you. Yeah. Great to be back on the pod. Not to have you. I had you 2 days ago on my podcast, so this is it's a great little reversal of roles here.
Yeah. So I think what we're going to do for this episode is I want to start at a high level of Bitcoin and Christianity. Why are these things kind of connected? Why have people been discovering all of these connections, and why is it becoming a thing, a bigger and bigger thing in the space? First off, and then secondly, let's transition to Thank God for Bitcoin, the organization. How did it start? What's your involvement there? Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, hopefully we'll be able to get JD on the call in a second here. But the Orange Umbrella, where does this idea come from? What's it about? What is this book about, and how can people get a hold of it and that whole thing? So yeah, big picture. Let's start at the top.
Yeah.
Bitcoin and Christianity.
I think for a lot of people, the topic of Bitcoin and Christianity is similar to their feelings about chocolate-covered anchovies. There's lots of people who may be stumbling across this who are like, listen, I hate anchovies and I hate chocolate-covered anchovies. Or maybe it would be like urine-covered anchovies. Ugh. I don't want to be anywhere near urine. I don't want to be anywhere near anchovies. The two things together are just awful. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of people. They're probably not watching this, but if they do, they're like awful. They're going to click off. Probably for Bitcoiners, okay, for the vast majority of them, the chocolate-covered anchovies is probably a better a better analogy here, because you're like, hey, I have this thing that I really like, which is chocolate. But then why are you putting the chocolate on the anchovies? Okay, yuck. We don't like that over there. And so again, I'm sympathetic to that. At first blush, these two things don't seem like they have a lot to do with one another. You have Bitcoin, which is this novel thing that's coming around and fixing lots of things that were broken and old and outdated and those kind of things, corrupt. And so why in the world would you pollute that seemingly great, pristine thing with something like religion, much less Christianity? So again, I'm sympathetic to people who have that perspective, and I would just respectfully disagree and would be happy to have conversations about why I think that is. But in terms of why this is, we could go a lot of directions, but I think one of the reasons why, at least from a Christian perspective, why do these two things connect? The Apostle Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians, I believe. I'm trying to think of what the verse is. It just left my head. 10:30, I think, is what it is. It says that whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. No, it says, actually, I'm sorry. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So basically, it's saying no matter what you're into or doing in your daily life, it can be done. It ought to be done for the glory of God. It ought to be done in such a way that we give thanks to God. We're grateful for the ability to do it. We're grateful for the strength to do it with. And so all of these things, there is a way to do anything that isn't outright sin. There's a way to do anything and a reason to care about any and everything through, because we care about God and because God is the originator of life and the giver of life and all these things. And so again, life is designed to be live for his glory. God has a plan for the world. He has a plan for people's lives. It's a good plan, and so we want to wield everything that exists for His glory. Now, again, Bitcoin, there are things that are neutral in the world. Okay, there's things like a crayon. Okay, like a crayon has no again, there's no moral component there to the use of a crayon. Potentially with the creation of the crayon, maybe if it was made by little kids in a sweatshop. But in terms of the usage of the crayon itself, like there's nothing inherently moral there. With money, that you can't say that. Money is not just a neutral thing because there are different types of money, and so Bitcoin as one's very specific type of money that incentivizes, whose creation and constraints are structured in a very particular way, and that contrast with the constraints that govern normal, what we would call normal fiat currency. It's very different, and so it incentivizes very different types of lives in the world. And so, insofar as Bitcoin is more closely aligned and very aligned with the way that God designed the world to work, which is something we can unpack a little bit more later. Insofar that it's more closely aligned with that, then it's something that Christians ought to care about, and it's something that really has everything to do with the Christian faith and how Christians look at the world and are called to operate in the world.
Yeah, I love all that. I think that's like huge big picture, right? Like, hey, we're just supposed to participate. Like this is all the things you're supposed to do. Like, but there's also something to be said about Bitcoin in particular. Like, 1 Corinthians 10:31, like you mentioned. So whether you eat or drink, do whatever you do all to the glory of God. Whatever you do all to the glory of God.
Yep.
Right. But then there's this thing, and you see it in some other things too. And we were talking about this earlier this week. There are some things, like you mentioned, that aren't neutral. Mm-hmm. For instance, slavery. Oh, we're just going to participate in slavery. Well, is that a neutral thing? Is that like okay to participate in slavery?
Yeah.
Or
no, it's not.
Yes, exactly. Or abortion. Is that a neutral thing to participate in abortion? And I think now we got JD on the
Let's go
on the show.
Let's go.
Hey. Sorry, I was a little late, guys.
No worries.
Make sure
we were just
works.
Yeah, we were just jumping in on big picture stuff with regard to the relationship between Bitcoin and Christianity. Jordan gave us a good introduction there, and then I kind of wanted to bring it home with the idea that there are some things, as Jordan mentioned, that are not neutral, and one of those things is fiat currency. And a lot of people, especially in the Bitcoin circles, or not Bitcoin, especially in Christian circles, just have no idea. These are very, it's just, oh, this is normative. This is fiat is just like a crayon to many people. It's, oh yeah, we can just use it for buying things or whatever. And like, that's not a problem.
Yeah.
So Jordan, do you want to go in and kind of describe why that is actually a problem? What is actually wrong with fiat, and why should a Christian care about that?
Yeah, again, this is something. So again, my background in Bitcoin, I've been on the podcast a few times, talked about it, but my background in Bitcoin, my way of getting in was basically I was a pastor and missionary living in Uruguay. Started a very small church that had basically, contrary to what we were thinking, ended up having about half the church be constituted of Venezuelan immigrants. So these were people who had their currency destroyed. They had their lives destroyed. These were not poor people. These were wealthy people. People were making over $100,000 worth, $100,000 a year in some cases. We had doctors, economists, like all these kind of things. And then a few years later, they had no money, and so they had to flee the country on foot, cross the border, take a bus 15, 20 hours to go to a totally different country where they were going to try to get a job, send money home, and eventually, hopefully, bring more family members with them. And so this is kind of my introduction. And so as introduction to this problem without knowing that it had anything to do with Bitcoin at that point. But once I did get into Bitcoin about 4 years later, I was still doing sermon prep as a pastor. And so one day I was in the book of Galatians. It's this letter that the Apostle Paul wrote, I believe from prison. And he was just writing to this group of people. And in the very end of the book, right near the end, he basically says that that God is not mocked, and that what a man sows, that will he also reap. And so basically is like this sowing and reaping idea is kind of, we see this within like agriculture. You plant one type of seed. If you plant an apple seed, you're not going to get a tomato tree. It's not how it works. You sow a certain type of seed and then you get that type of plant back. And so this is kind of what Paul was trying to communicate. And so again, a lot of the people in our church were new believers. They were new Christians. They didn't grow up in a Christian Christian household where these things were obvious. And so I just remember trying to think of like, okay, how would I rephrase this in a way that would, make sense to somebody who doesn't have a lot of history with these things? And so I just said, okay, so Paul is claiming that God has so hardwired this principle of sowing and reaping into the fabric of the universe that to deny that fact is to mock God. It's just super obvious that, God has created a world where you reap what you sow. And so I just started thinking again, I just was like, okay, well, if this is so obvious, well, then there better be a whole bunch of examples of this that better be pretty clear. And so I just started thinking like, okay, what are some of these examples? And so the first one that came to mind is from another one of Paul's letters to the churches in Thessalonica, this place in Greece. And so they basically said, Paul's writing to them and he basically says, hey, if these guys, they believed in Jesus, and they got to the point where they're like, hey, we believe Jesus is coming back in our lifetimes. And so we're just going to stop working. We're going to stop working. We're just going to, just get ready for Jesus. We're going to tell people about him, whatever. And so the Apostle Paul responds to them and says, listen, if one isn't willing to work, then neither should he eat. And I just remember thinking, oh yeah. So Paul's saying that there's a relationship between the energy that you get from food. He's saying it's designed to be stewarded for the service of others. And so if you're not willing to acknowledge that relationship between food and work, then you shouldn't eat. And if you continue that relationship for long enough, if you don't eat for long enough, what's going to happen? You're going to die. And so like there's a real sense in which we're alive in order to work to serve our own families and then other people, to love our neighbors in that way. And so I just started trying to think of a whole bunch of them. God has a logic and an order for a whole host of things. And so as I got to the end, I was like starting to think to myself, well, man, after thinking of all these different examples, I thought, man, it would be really cool as a pastor if there was one of these that, culminated in Jesus. Because this is how Christians do things. Jesus is the capstone for a lot of our arguments.
It's the way.
Exactly. And so I started thinking about the nature of sin within Christianity and how it contrasts to for example, specifically the Islamic understanding of sin. So within Islam, they don't understand and they don't believe that Jesus had to die. They basically say, no, Allah, in their conception, God can just forgive sins. He can just kind of papally declare sins are forgiven. There doesn't need to be a payment for sins.
Yeah.
And so basically they don't understand this. Whereas within Christianity, like the Bible says the soul that sins must die. The only way to get rid of sin, which scripture frequently refers to and compares with debt, is to have somebody actually pay the debt. And so this is why Jesus in the Christian, conception of these things had to die, was to pay for the sins of the world, pay for sins that was committed. And so it was a way for this objective sin debt to be paid in a way that still allows me and us as humans to not have to endure the penalty for sins ourselves. We basically, Jesus takes our debt, he pays it for us, and then we're able to go free. And so one of the things that hit me with this as I was trying to, thinking through these things, is I contrasted that with thinking about fiat currency, which fiat currency fundamentally gives governments and central banks the ability to create money out of thin air with very little, effectively no production cost. So basically, governments and central banks are able to reap where they haven't sown. They're able to deny, functionally, at least in the short term, they deny this principle of sowing and reaping. They just basically say, hey, debt's no big deal. Debt is just money we owe ourselves. All of these things, currency, we can create reality out of thin air in ways that benefit us, which is what fiat currency does. It always benefits the rich and the powerful, the connected, over against the poor and the weak. And so this, again, I just saw the contrast between these two systems, the world that God made and the world that central bankers and governments are increasingly making. And I just saw, man, these two things are completely at odds with each other. And so if that's true, and it is, then the downstream consequences of this are very problematic and horrible, not just physically for the people who are living in the world experiencing them. They're also horrible spiritually in terms of people's relationship with God, in terms of just denying and ignoring the way that God has actually designed the world to operate. And so, again, this is one of these things where people from the beginning have always tried to set aside God's design for the world and establish their own. And this fiat currency is just the latest instantiation of this.
Yeah, that's awesome. JD, what for you connects Bitcoin and Christianity? Why are these things interesting as they seemingly separate topics? Why are they so interesting? What is it about fiat? What is it about Bitcoin? What is it about Christianity?
Let me know if my mic sounds okay. It's like right here under
it's good
under screen. I'm on my remote setup today with the iPhone and the mic here. But I guess what's the key pieces, like what makes these two things interesting? I think it's kind of what
big picture.
I think big picture is kind of what just Jordan said, right? And it's stuff I've been dealing with in my own life of like you reap what you sow, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's a hard pill to swallow as the head of the household, as the husband, when there's disarray in your family. It's your fault. Period. Doesn't matter. And as the husband, that's a tough thing for me to constantly remind myself of, because it's like, what am I do? I have done something wrong that has led this entire thing astray. And I think what makes that interesting is the capacity for redemption, but it goes to what Jordan was just saying through sacrifice. Something must be paid. Bitcoin is a almost near perfect money because it obeys the laws of physics, because it obeys truth. Truth is binary. Something is true or it is not true. You are moving or you are not moving. Like there is no, not moving is a state, but you cannot be not moving and also moving. The only thing that can be not moving but also moving is time, right? Because like technically, it is just a momentum. It is a constant thing. So like it never changes because it's always going 1 second at a time. So technically it's not moving, but it is moving because it has a constant, right? And so what is interesting about all of that and kind of like landing it on here is the most unique thing about humanity is the fact that we are the only species that has stories. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin is a near perfect way for storytelling to be decentralized in a way that no one can argue with it for potentially 100 to 200 years. And storytelling specifically on the monetary sense, right? And the value sense. Like I'm not saying, I'm 100% against ordinals and all those other things, right? But the store of value piece here, where it's like, hey, this person has 100, 1,000, 10, 1, half, whatever it is. The story there is they did some work. They took some risk. They took a chance to acquire a thing, Bitcoin. And everyone can see that. And now that can further their story in the greater story of humanity in a way that's really interesting, because the only other thing that has ever done that ever in a decentralized manner is the Bible. The Bible is the only set of stories, or the only, ledger, if you will, of truth that has been decentralized for millennia and yet been constantly corroborated over and over and over and over again. We can argue about translations. We can argue about, some of the minute details, but it is the only document that was protected by a 51% attack because it was decentralized. I went and saw the Dead Sea Scrolls thing here in in
Let's
Southern
go.
California. And one of the things that they talked about was the fact that they found the scrolls in a destroyed Jerusalem in the walls, right? They found them like by the Dead Sea in all these little caverns distributed. It's like they didn't put all of it into one cavern. It was like thousands of caverns all the way in the back, like buried. They decentralized the ledger. They distributed amongst a bunch of different places so that way it could be protected. And so when a truth is so important that it requires, or rather it would warrant that amount of care to protect, it's important. And that's why landing the plane, Bitcoin is important in my mind, because even this opportune stuff that's going on right now, it's actually important because it changes the nature of what Bitcoin is and what we're trying to do. Like, are we trying to create a distributed database that I can store the Bible on? I mean, people have stored Bible verses in there, and I think people have, you said like Luke himself has like, inscribed, or rather, put Bible verses on the opportune, right? I think you need to know his address. I don't know anybody of these people's addresses, but unless they like signed it. But the moral of the story here is it's like the nature of what we're trying to do, with Bitcoin, and why it's so interesting is it's the first time we're trying to democratize truth and decentralized truth in the context that we as humans can understand it. And what that context is the ownership of a thing. And in this particular case, that thing is a UTXO, or that thing is a key that goes into a wallet that has some Bitcoin that is a store of value that you can use to trade for things. So very long-winded, but I think that's the thing that I find the most interesting and unique is like Bitcoin warrants so much care because it protects so much value in the same way that the Bible warranted so much care to protect and maintain throughout the millennia because it protects so much value. Eternity in my mind is the most valuable thing. Bitcoin in my mind is probably the second most valuable thing in terms of worldly things. So anyways.
Yeah, I love that. The idea that the Bible is a distributed truth, and then the nature of truth itself. Well, it's like, well, something is either true or it's not true. If it's true, well, then it's universally true. Like, even if it's a very specific thing, well, it's, that specific thing exists in a context, and for all the same context, that specific thing is always going to be true, like universally. If there was no universal truth, well, then there's no truth, because relativism and blah blah blah. There is a universal, ever-present truth, right? And when you talk about decentralization, what are we talking about here? What's the end state of decentralization? There's an ongoing discussion about what is quote unquote decentralized. Well, what would be the ultimate decentralization would be universal. It's universal. Bitcoin being, the more decentralized it gets, the more universal it gets. The more centralized it gets, the more fungible, the more changeable, the more mutable it gets. So there's an interesting overlap there. In terms of Bitcoin and Christianity, there's so many other things that are exactly like that. Jordan, you just wrote another book that basically kind of outlined that entire case of all of these different things that are, and I don't know if you want to talk about that for a little bit, but like, there are so many things, there are so many overlaps, there's so many weird things that are like, oh yeah, this is, you thought you knew this, but hold on.
Yeah, I mean, here's one example. So, and this, at least, I mean, if you're a Christian, so there's a couple ways in which the Bible argues that just seem really weird on the surface. So one of them is basically you have the Apostle Paul. He's talking about marriage, and he basically says marriage is a mystery, and he basically says, this union that happens between a man and a woman. You have these two people who they're separate, like, prior to getting married, they're two separate people, and then when they get married, they come together and they become one person. And this is true in a whole bunch of different ways. Like, you are not the same. I'm not the same person I was, 15 years ago when I got married. Like, I'm a very different person. And so there's like a whole bunch of ways in which you fundamentally change. And the Apostle Paul is describing this, and he basically says, hey, I'm telling you that marriage, like, the origin for marriage is coming from Christ in the relationship between Christ and the church, which is this really weird thing, because our initial reflex is to think, no. Okay, so God created human marriage between a man and a woman, and then the church, which in our experience of this comes into existence thousands of years later, like this has, like, he's using basically this physical reality as a pattern upon which to create this new spiritual reality. And the Apostle Paul goes, no, it's actually the exact opposite of that, because God had this pattern of like of like the Christ in the church. He had this pattern from before the foundation of the world, before the world was ever made. And so this same thing is also talked about. You have fatherhood talked about in the same way. The Apostle Paul describes God as the father from whom every family in heaven and earth is named. So like, where do we get this idea of family? Well, God is a father. He tells us to call him a father. He's always existed. So there's this spiritual, eternal blueprint that then God creates a physical version of that we experience. And then obviously on top of that, there's other things. So this idea of spiritual, eternal blueprint that we have a physical instantiation of, like, this is how reality works. And so I think the same thing is true of money. And I'm like working, I've got another book in process that nice. The writing of books will never come to an end. But like where I'm just like trying to map this out of, like, money is not just this thing that people just come up with. Like, money is this eternally, again, blueprinted thing that we have physical analogs of. But one of the examples that you have of this is, one of the examples that you have of this is money itself. And so one of the things that was crazy to me as I got into Bitcoin was just thinking about and just seeing how many things there are within Bitcoin that just point to like spiritual truth and point to specifically Christian truth. And so the one that I always share with people, and the one that I always mention is one day I tried to send a Bitcoin transaction. I was running out the door. I sent it real quick. I'd only been in Bitcoin for 6 months. I sent this transaction. There was like no fees needed at that point. So I did like the bare minimum fee, payment or whatever, and then ran out the door, forgot about it. 2 weeks later, I checked my wallet and the transaction hadn't gone through. And so I just was like, oh no, I broke Bitcoin. And so crazily at this point, I guess it was more like 9 months. So 9 months in, I had become friends with Jimmy Song. And so I just texted Jimmy and I was like, Jimmy, I broke Bitcoin. What did I do? What do I do to fix this? And he goes, no, you didn't break Bitcoin. He's like, all you need to do is a child pays for parent transaction. And I was like, great. What does that mean? So he goes, okay, so what you did is you tried to send money. You didn't include enough of a fee for the transaction to be included in the block. So all you have to do is send another identical transaction and just include more of a fee. And it won't send 2 transactions. It'll actually just send like 1 transaction. The initial transaction will get through to its intended destination. So I tried it. It ended up working. And I was kind of just thinking about it and reflecting on it. It just blew my mind that just to realize like that is the same logic of what of how salvation works in the Christian framework, which is God sends out, he creates people, he designs them to arrive at a certain certain destination. We're supposed to live a certain way. We're supposed to trust him and act in a certain way. And we fall short of that. Okay. This is the scriptures talk about falling short of the glory of God, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We don't reach this intended, telos, this destination that God designed us to attain. And so how does God resolve that? Well, he sends the last Adam instead of the first Adam. He sends the last Adam. He sends another transaction, if you will. And Jesus does live the life that God intended us to live. He obeys him perfectly in everything. He trusts his Father perfectly in everything. And because of his perfect transaction of his life, we are able to benefit from that perfectly executed transaction and arrive at our intended destination because of him. And so this book that you're referring to, which is right there, The Gospel According to Bitcoin, just looks at money and Bitcoin in particular, and just basically said, hey, there's tons of like parable-like things within Bitcoin and within money itself that are pointing to something far more important in lasting and eternal than money itself. And so again, we see all of these things, like everything that exists, whether it's food or drink, whether it's cameras, computers. These are all communicating things. If it's a good thing, it's communicating something about God. It's communicating something about the way that God has designed the world to work. And so we want to just acknowledge those realities wherever we find them, including in Bitcoin.
One of the things from the book, by the way, guys should all check out the book. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. One of the things I loved about the book was the example. I think Daniel wrote this section, but it was the example of the transaction where Abraham purchases a lot for Sarah's burial.
Yep.
And the way that the transaction occurs is that he negotiates the transaction with the owner of the lot, and then they announce publicly to all of the elders that this transaction has taken place. I'm now the owner. This is how much I paid for it. This is the date we paid for it. They just lay out all of the transaction details, and they broadcast this transaction to all the elders in that village or town, or I forget the name of the city that it was, right?
Yep, me too.
But that image is like, wait a second, that's a Bitcoin. That's the exact same as what a Bitcoin transaction does. We're just doing it all electronically, where you write all the information about the transaction, everybody signs it, so it's all verified, and then you broadcast the transaction out, and then everybody now has a copy of the transaction and it gets included in the blockchain. And so now everybody everywhere can just go look and reference. No, if there's a dispute, no, this is who owns that Bitcoin.
Yeah,
this is when it took place. It's a clear ledger about how and you talk about God has designed reality in such a way as a spiritual level before any of the actual physical manifestation of it. Yeah. And here we are getting to live that out and play through these principles that God has already established and defined in really beautiful ways.
And it's super cool, right? Because like even if you move into like the New Testament, you have these guys, the apostles, like they're chosen by Jesus and then sent out by him to communicate his message. And so one of the things you see them doing all the time is just public proclamations. Like they're not like communicating these things in secret. They're going out and announcing publicly, this is what we've heard. This is what we've heard from God. This is what he's told us to say. This is what he's told us to do. And they do the same thing. They're just like completing the same thing. They're like, hey, we want to announce this publicly. We've seen these things. We want to tell as many people as we can, like, this is what we've seen. This is what we have observed. This is what we've heard. And again, we want to just broadcast it out there on the public ledger of your hearts and minds, and just communicate these things so that you hear them and understand them.
So with that in mind, there's all these connections between Christianity, the Bible, and Bitcoin. There's all these weird things that are going on, and we've just literally only scratched the surface. There's so much more. It just keeps going on and on.
Yep.
Okay. Now, how does Thank God for Bitcoin come about? How did it come about? Why did it come about? What was the impetus here? Like, who's the first idea that this, like, and then what happened after that? Like, how did Thank God for Bitcoin become such a voice in this space?
Yeah. So I think the three people who are given credit or fault, depending on who you are Jimmy Song, George McHale, who works for Bitcoin Magazine, and I can't remember who the third one is. There was somebody else, maybe Brian Harrington. I don't think it was him, but there was three people. Those three guys, they basically said, hey, they found out they were Christians, and they said, hey, let's start doing like a Bible study where we study what the Bible says about money. And so they started doing that. They met for a few months. And so after a few months, they said, man, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. They were also all into Bitcoin. And so they basically said,
I think this was during COVID time too. Like, it was like everyone just kind of met online.
This is a little bit before that. Okay. So that's how they met and started meeting. And then once COVID hit, then they basically said, hey, we should do like a book club. We got a bunch of time on our hands. We should do like a book club. So let's read through a couple books about money, that are either written by Christians or that talk about a Christian perspective. And so the two books that they chose were one very short book called Honest Money. It's written like a ninth grade reading level. It's a great little book written by Gary North, who was the economic policy advisor for Ron Paul during one of his presidential campaigns. And he also was like a big voice within the Mises Institute. but also a Christian like theologian, most prolific author about Christians and money out of ever basically. And so he wrote this book. We read it. We thought that was great. I got connected to this slightly larger group through just Twitter. I got on Twitter and saw this guy talking about Jesus and Bitcoin. I thought, wait, I'm not the only one thinking about these things. And then he invited me to join this Telegram group that when I got in there, I look around at the list of people and I see Jimmy, who I didn't know at that point. I saw Robert Breedlove. I was like, whoa, wait, I do know him. Like, this is wild. So we started reading through these books. And then the other book that we read was The Ethics of Money Production by another Austrian economist named Jörg Guido Hulsmann. That one's more of a scholarly book, but it just is a fantastic book. So we read through those two things, just talked about them. And again, met for an hour a week. That was all that it was. Finished after 2 months. I thought to myself, well, that was the weirdest thing that I've ever done in my life. A Bitcoin Christian, book club. And so when we got done, I just thought that was it. Went back to my life and in lockdown wearing double masks. No, I'm just kidding. So we went back to what I was doing. And then 3 weeks later, George reached out to me and said, hey, we really appreciated your contributions to this book club. And long story short, we're going to write our own book that kind of summarizes what these two books talk about. But rather than the payoff being what those books is, which is really going back to a gold standard, we think that we could write the payoff being, this is why we should adopt Bitcoin. This is why Christians should care about these things. And so I just basically said, well, dude, I don't have time to write a book. Like, I'm pastoring this small church. I've got little kids. And he just basically said, okay, but like, we're going to work on it like 1 day a week for, an hour. And then like take a little bit of free time during the week to kind of map this thing out in the beginning. And then we'll just kind of go from there. But it's not going to be like a huge time commitment because there's going to be 8 of us working on the book. So long story short, I ended up doing it. And about 6 months later, we published the book right at the beginning of 2021 as the price is pumping and, everybody was happy on, on Bitcoin Twitter. And the response was just nuts because again, we had no aspirations of that this was going to be some sort of popular book. We were like, hey, us and our moms are going to really enjoy this book. It's going to be, really cool. And then in God's providence, Corey, this is for you. The book came out the same week as the book by the Pope, and we were outselling the Pope. So he said, take that, Bishop of Rome. Where are you at, bro? Wow. This is every Protestant's dream. So it was great.
Okay. So that talks about the origin of Thank God for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
What happened next? How did it become an organization? How did it become essentially like, you guys have published a bunch of books now, or two books, but
two more.
But it's become.
I'll call that a
you're
bunch.
Also you're also doing conferences. You're also doing booths at things and like all of this stuff. It's really become a thing, and there's a lot of community and people involved all over the place at this point.
Yeah, and that was surprising. Like most surprising to us was just how many people there were that had either been thinking about Bitcoin and were Christians and had wanted something like this. And then, through their efforts, through a lot of their efforts, just more people who had really wanted to understand these things and really were seeing a lot of the same things, or maybe saw that something was wrong, but didn't know how to describe it or what the reasoning was. Because in Thank God for Bitcoin, we only talk about Bitcoin in the last 2 chapters. Much of the book is just unpacking like, what is money? What is it designed to do? How does what it's designed to do have downstream effects on our lives spiritually and all kinds of other stuff? And so, for a lot of people, we just have gotten all kinds of just really just mind-blowing feedback for us, which is just like, this book was so helpful in so many ways. And I've given out dozens of copies of this book. And so within 6 months of the book coming out, we were hearing all kinds of these stories. And so about a year after the book came out, my buddy Ashua is the director of Brilliance Labs, which is this nonprofit organization that is leveraging Bitcoin and using Bitcoin all over the world to help international missions and like cross-cultural ministry. He just basically met Jimmy somehow and just basically said, hey, you guys should do like a conference. You should do like a 1-day conference, maybe in Miami the day before the big Bitcoin conference. And so, Jimmy was like, hey, let's hop on a call. So 4 or 5 of us hopped on a call, and long story short, ended up deciding to do a conference in Miami. And we had about 6 weeks to put it together, which again, knowing what I know now about doing conferences, I would have said we don't have enough time. 6 weeks isn't enough. but again, in God's providence, it was more than enough. And so we ended up putting together a conference, had like 175 people show up. And it was wild. I mean, we had like Tim Tebow came somehow. Blake Masters from Teal Capital, like the head of Teal Capital, like shows up. It was just all these random things where we're like, we just couldn't take credit for any of this because we had no clue. Yeah. We had no like small budget, and just didn't have any aspirations of greatness. But just a lot of people showed up. And so in the aftermath of the first conference, I was talking to Lyle Pratt, who was one of the other authors of Thank God for Bitcoin, one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And I was just telling him, like, we'd come back from Uruguay. I had brought my resume to the Bitcoin conference to plan on looking for at least a part-time job. And Lyle just said to me, he's like, I know what you need to do. And again, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced somebody who had a great plan for your life. But I was like, oh, really? What's that, Lyle? Nice. And he just said, I think you should do Thank God for Bitcoin full-time. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, I think you could do like conferences and, sell sponsorships to the conference and sell tickets and then like write other books and, host podcasts and do a bunch of these, sell merch, do this kind of stuff. And I think you can, make enough to make it work. And so I just started thinking about it, had another conversation with Oshawa, who was really more focused on the mission side of things and just the need for, both churches, other nonprofit entities, both in the United States and around the world. Because again, their nonprofit organizations are much more quickly and drastically affected by currency devaluation. And so to really try to work to help them, understand and grok the importance of this before they get absolutely destroyed through, losing purchasing power, losing donors because there's not enough, people are losing margin to be able to donate to them. So once you could combine those two things, I was much more interested and much more excited about it. And so long story short, we ended up getting some funding from some of the other authors of Thank God for Bitcoin, and funded almost all of it in Bitcoin. And so we just have kept our entire treasury in Bitcoin, and then we just sell some off as we need to. And again, it's been we would have had to raise more money by this point if we hadn't done that. So we're kind of like proving the thesis of Bitcoin,
love it,
of things being better with Bitcoin.
Indeed. All right. So JD, maybe you want to answer this, but Jordan, you're welcome to as well. How did you get involved? What is your connection to this story?
Yeah. Outside of making these graphics while you guys were talking, I made these. We don't normally throw things up on the screen, but honestly, I do think both these books are valuable. So you should get them.
Indeed.
And I just figured I'd throw them up there because I have, 5 seconds to do it, and the QR code should work. But the TLDR is Pacific Bitcoin, RIP. Hey man, I hope they bring it back. If not,
me too.
That'd be awesome.
Convince
me too. It was
Corey
a great conference.
To sell us the IP for it or whatever. Or hey, Corey, if you're watching, let us know. Maybe we can take it over for you. But the first Pacific Bitcoin, which was 2022, I believe. They threw like a side event, and they being Thank God for Bitcoin, and just happened to like find that side event, go there, meet Jordan, kind of hit it off, and then kind of like throughout the week ended up like driving you back and forth to your Airbnb a couple times, and just kind of like getting to know you over that, but then also just kind of being at that conference and just kind of struck up a friendship. And then was privileged enough for you to kind of bring me out to help with the conference in 2023 in Miami when you guys went back. And just kind of over the years of just kind of getting to know and kind of like be really good friends with Jordan, and just also working with Thank God for Bitcoin, loving the mission that they're on, loving what they're doing, we kind of started just having bigger, longer, deeper conversations, which ended in us kind of going back and forth on my Mid-Journey account of like, hey, here's some random things that AI is doing. Oh, look at this. It's Will Smith eating spaghetti or whatever it is. And
classic.
Yeah. Classic.
Classic.
Pre-slap Will. Pre-slap Will, just to be clear.
Pre-slap Will, yes. who did look a lot more like the AI generated spaghetti eating Will than the current Will does.
Indeed.
And Jordan, I just remember like getting like a text, and it was like, 10 p.m. my time, which was like 1 a.m. or whatever. Jordan's side. I'm like, 1, why are you awake? But 2, he's like, dude, this would be a great book. And it was an Orange Umbrella with like two little kids kind of standing under it, which was the original like kind of key art that we used. And we were kind of like shopping this around and talking through it. And just kind of the story kind of started to grip both of us. And we both like to go down rabbit holes. So we, and we both like physics. So we kind of got in a lot of different moments, like really into the physics of the world. But then we also had to step back and be like, who cares? Like nobody cares about some of these things. Like one nerdy person might, but the most won't.
Yep.
And then, over the course of the next kind of like 2 years, we put that together. We like wrote the entire thing. He flew out to LA. We took like a 3-day stint and literally just like wrote the entire thing, going back and forth. Lots of revisions, lots of revs. I think we did like 29 or 31 versions of the actual text. And then Jordan took it and did an additional rev to do all the poetry, because he's a poet and I actually did not know it. And come on, I'm going to do the softballs.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to do the softballs. But no, it was great. And then we unfortunately had we had really high aspirations to try and have somebody do the entire book in watercolor, right? Because it's rain. We wanted water. We want it to be like really interesting, unique, and dynamic. And we found a phenomenal watercolor artist named Terry, who is in the UK, and he's done a lot of like actual like Bitcoin art, but he was just too busy. Like he kept getting busy, and it was one of those things like the price was also going down at that point in time. So it's kind of hard for either of us to be like, oh, we can spend some money, but it's like, we'd rather buy Bitcoin. So we don't really have any money to spend on this. And I just kind of through that period of time ended up having to go through and like find some other artists, and that didn't really work out. And then come January of this year, Jordan just was like, nope, we are finding this artist and making this happen. And then we kind of did a whole Fiverr stint and like Upwork, and oh man, I think we probably tested like 20 or 30 different artists there too.
Oh wow.
It was
there are certain moments where just like, this would actually probably just be easier to use AI than it would to actually like try and get a person to physically do this. But then through kind of God's providence, like a friend of a friend of a friend, I think that Jordan knows, was like, hey, I know this girl named Karis. She might be able to help you out. And she's been a dream. She's phenomenal. Like the artwork in this book, like Jordan, you can probably go on and on about it too, but it's pretty stellar. It's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I think, the thing that for me was the wildest in terms of just, again, the backtrack a little bit, like meeting JD, again, you have people who you just meet and you just click with them. And JD and I just met at this conference out of nowhere. We started talking for 5 minutes. We ended up getting shoved in an Uber with Zuby together somehow. And then like JD's cousin is like a pretty well-known person on social media. And so she had interacted with Zuby. And so it was like all these random things. And then again, usually you have like conferences are like camp. Okay. Like you meet people at conferences and you're like, oh, like we're really good friends. And then you go home and you never talk to each other ever again, or until the next camp or the next conference. But JD and I pretty much talked like every day for like 3 months after that conference. It was the weirdest thing. I'll still never forgive him. And never
times my wife was like, you're talking to Jordan.
I'll still never forgive him.
I'll still never forgive him for not forcing me to buy a box of Series 1 Bitcoin trading cards, which
you can buy it off me. It's still a Chester set the floor, 0.3 Bitcoin. It's ready to give Chester if you're watching. I'm with you, brother.
So yeah, the last box was like $500. I could have bought 2 or 3 of them for $500 each. And then 3 months later, they're all selling for $5,000. I was like, why? So we just became really good friends. And again, JD is completely different than I am. All like the complete polar opposite skills. And legitimately one of the hardest workers I've ever seen and met in my life. Just constantly working hard, constantly just trying to do right by people. And so I just really found myself wanting to spend time with them, wanting to work with them. And then, again, JD in a previous life worked on the first 2 seasons of the show Rick and Morty. And I had a whole bunch of, just a great, more storied history in entertainment and actually getting projects across the line. I'm good at like starting projects. JD is really good at like finishing them and getting them across the line. And so I just realized, I need somebody who has those instincts and skills and abilities if this thing's going to actually get done. And so it ended up, I couldn't have asked for a better teammate in getting this thing across the line. So,
Oh, shucks. No, but I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the book internally. What is this book about? The idea came from a picture of an umbrella, but how does this relate to Christianity? How does this relate to Bitcoin? I know you guys have said that there's a lot in common here. So what's the...
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that I would say is kind of like, it really does kind of, at least conceptually. So Thank God for Bitcoin exists for three reasons, like primarily to minister and like to serve three audiences. The first one is just like Christian Bitcoiners. These are the only psychos who are going to pay for, who are going to pay us to be able to continue to do this. So they're a smaller group, obviously smaller subset of Bitcoiners more broadly. But again, they're like, hey, these are our, people who are really into what we're doing. So we're going to try to create stuff for them. But then beyond that, it's Christians who aren't Bitcoiners yet. Like we are Christians. We think that, this is the most important message in the world. And we think that, money and the devaluation of currencies is going to really have a horrible effect. And it is having horrible effects on people who are trying to communicate that message all across the world. So that's the second group. That's the largest group, but the least interested in what we're doing. Yeah. And then the third group is people who are into Bitcoin, who are fully on Team Bitcoin, but who don't yet see the value of Jesus. And so, and who may never see the value of Jesus. But so it was one of these things where, again, just as we do what we do, as we put together conferences and we think about inviting speakers, we keep all three of those audiences in mind and make our decisions through that framework. And so very much, it wasn't necessarily purposefully this way. We didn't like set out to write a book that would be cool for all three of those groups. But about half, at least partially part of the way through, we just realized, man, this is like a really good standalone story that even if you knew nothing about Bitcoin or nothing about, you didn't care about this at all. We don't use the word Bitcoin in the book. And that was purposeful. But like, even if you didn't know anything or care anything about Bitcoin, this book is still great. Like, it's still a really cool story. But if you're into Bitcoin, then you're really going to like this story because there's a ton of Easter eggs in the text, in some of the characters themselves that are they're full of like Bitcoin Twitter meme things and just all these different things that you're just really going to appreciate. And then on top of that, again, if you're a Christian and into Bitcoin, there's other things that you're going to really recognize and be really stoked out about it as well. So yeah, in terms of the actual story, it's really like an island. It's just a pretty simple story of an island where it never rains, but everybody carries an umbrella. And so again, it's a place where it rained one time a way long time ago. It was super traumatic to the point that everybody was like, we need to create umbrellas to protect ourselves from the rain. In the beginning, there was only one initial umbrella. It was a golden umbrella. And so everybody kind of hid underneath that one. But in the aftermath of this storm, like 10 years goes by. And so again, it's one of these things where, people, they're like, we need umbrellas. Let's make umbrellas. But they started arguing, all the different people who lived on this island started arguing about what should the umbrella look like, what strengths should it have, what weaknesses, this kind of stuff. And so over time, even though they all recognize we need umbrellas, they kind of took different approaches. And so there were people who wanted umbrellas like this and umbrellas like that, or umbrellas like this. And then on top of that, it also became, because of the differences of opinion that they had, they just started arguing about it. And so they ended up all going their separate ways and each working on their own umbrellas. So you've got these different characters who have different umbrellas that, that have different strengths and that are designed to do different things based on that specific person's perceptions of the dangers of a storm, that the storm would bring when it comes.
Love it.
Yes.
JD, what's your inspiration for this? Where do you come up with these ideas and what gets you excited about this project?
Yeah, I think what was the most I love. So one thing that I've done quite a bit of, I've actually done, I think Steve, you've been in some of them, Jordan, I know you've been in a bunch of them. But I do these writers' rooms where I take the process from Rick and Morty, which is the Dan Harmon story circle. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically the hero's journey, but on a circle. But that's what Dan used to break every episode of Community, every episode of Rick and Morty, and it's a very simple method for making sure your story has all the pieces of a story, right? Like at the end of the day, if you have a math equation, you need X plus Y equals Z, right? You need to have, or equals or whatever, right? You need to have all the different components. If you're going to bake a cake, you need to have the flour, you need to have the sugar, you need to have the vanilla, you need to have like the recipe. And so this framework, because that's what it is actually what I find the most exciting. Like I really love the like creation and generation and like the teasing out of a story and trying to then kind of put it into a box. Like my key things are like, competition, significance, activating, and ideation are like my top things on like strengths finders. But I really love that ideation piece of things, because if you can find a way to tie disparate things together in a surprising and fun way, you can move somebody in a direction you didn't expect. And that's actually what this entire story did. It was a lot of discussion on, should it be an island? Should there be multiple islands? Should there be, should it be a tall island? Should it be a cave? Should it be like, just kind of going in there and really kind of digging into the core of the story, I think was the most exciting part for me. And then just, doing the whole Apple thing of like simplify, and just like simplifying it to the point where you're like, okay, this is actually what we need to actually say to actually make people understand and care. And for the most, the biggest piece of this, though, is also then having something that I can go like read with my kids. The book is probably a little older than, your 1, 2, and 3-year-old. It's probably more for like a 6 and 7 and maybe even a little bit older. Like it's definitely still something like high school kids can find interesting, especially with like the poetry. And then like the bigger concepts are like high school kids. It's like, oh, okay. So the rain is inflation. And it's like, some of these bigger concepts they're not really going to get. But I think what's really cool is, kind of in the Shrek aspect of it, where it's like, we don't have like tongue-in-cheeky jokes in it because it's not really the place for it. But like these bigger concepts in this kid's story, I think is really cool and really universal. And so the other thing that's cool is also, getting to work with Jordan, getting to work with Karis as a great artist. And then also, all these ancillary things that we're looking to do too, because like making physical things is just fun. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think one of the things for me, like one of the things that came out that really, so I flew out to LA to do like this, 2 or 3 day, you just like sprint to try to get this book done in terms of the structure of it. And then I would kind of go and just try to do the poetry and actual, the lines of the book. And so one of the things that was crazy is like, we went and we'd done a number of things over the phone, had a pretty good idea, but like, as we started to talk about it, first of all, like we were at JD's house, and like, what was going on? Something was going on with your kid. I can't remember what was going on. And yeah, we didn't end up getting anywhere near as much time as we thought we were going to get. And it was one of these things where you're just like, oh man, we flew out here to do that. Or I flew out here to do this thing. And it ended up being like perfect. Like I got to spend time with his family, got to meet his kids and his wife and just like hang out. And so it just was one of these things where it's like, we never would have, if you would have told us in advance, we're literally going to get probably 4 cumulative hours to work, or 4 or 5 cumulative hours to work on this thing, we would never have signed up for it. And yet it was phenomenal. And when we were doing it, and most of it was on like the last day that I was there. So then as we're working, like one of the things that I didn't realize was like, I had like, because like some of these ideas, like I had been thinking about for a year, and I had like so personalized, they were so like personal to me that like JD is like suggesting changing some of them. And I'm like getting like emotionally like frustrated. I'm like, and so really the thing that hit me as we were sitting there trying to work out some of these things and like getting, JD's like trying to reason with a crazy person. And I'm sitting there trying to be like, dude, no, we're not changing that. Like, there's no way. And it just hits me that we're just like the umbrella people in the book who had like, they were arguing about creating umbrellas. They had their certain, like their own individual conceptions of what the umbrella should look like. And they ended up splitting up because they couldn't actually work together. And when that reality hit me, I was like, holy crap. Like this is,
again, we got a lot more work after that time. So it was
we did. No, for real. Because it was just like, it humbled. I mean, at least on my end, like it humbled me of just being like, oh man, this isn't just a book. Like literally there's bigger bigger picture principles here that are just super, I mean, just super close to home. They're hitting really close to home even now as we're writing this thing. And so I think like that's the bigger thing. Like it's not, we didn't set out with all these dramatic, highfalutin desires, but at the end of the day, like the end product of the book, like it really just kind of hits me. I get goosebumps every single time I get to the end of the book. I've read it 100 times, like every single time, just because it really does touch on these really just close to home themes. So
I think the biggest thing too is, because one of the things that I was actually pretty adamant about was like the rhyming. I said no. I was like, that's stupid. I was like, dude, nobody's gonna care. It doesn't really matter. It's not a big deal. And I'm royally humbled because I do think you did a phenomenal job of kind of like getting in there and using your poetry award. I'm kidding, but using your really well honed and articulate form of poetry, because I don't even know what you would call like the way you do prose, but like you have a very specific style of prose, and it works. Like even in the little excerpts you've been sharing with folks, like I'm excited for people to kind of like see this bigger thing. And then also, I think one of the other things that was cool, because we had a in that like back and forth, I also think I was pretty aggressive. I think I was pretty aggressive also in some of my I don't want to change this kind of things, but I think it's a cool process, because I think that's one thing that's really tough for the current generation is like the creative process is messy and it's hard and it's like whenever you're birthing anything, and so it's really it was a cool process to kind of go through and be like, oh, are we really going to argue about this? And it's like,
yeah, we are. And well, I think the other thing too, like the thing that just over and over again, the thing that just stopped me in my tracks is there were things that JD would bring up that at first blush, I was like, no way. And then like it wasn't just like I just came to the realization. I'm like, oh, he's just brilliant. But like he would like flesh it out. We'd get down the road and I would just be like, oh my gosh, yeah, he's totally right. How in the world didn't I see that before? Like he's totally right and so it just was this, again, it was a respect thing of just like, cause it's like it was just a mutual respect thing of like, dang, like this guy, from my perspective, I'm like, he's done this. He's worked for Apple. He's worked for Toyota. He's worked for some of the biggest, most powerful companies on earth. And they're not just out there, what's it called? Diversity hiring. he's really good.
President.
Yeah. he's really good at what he does. He's really good at it. And so like, again, like that's the book never would have gotten done. Never. And it would have been a worse story in 100 ways if it wasn't for him. So again,
can you confirm the wallet address I need to send this check to, by the way?
No, but like honestly, that's
I appreciate it. That's very, very sweet. But I also think it's like we could go back and forth on the gravy train of love. But I do actually want to go because I do have to jump here in a minute, but I want to give I think the most important thing you said in there is actually the key to any creative process is respect. Because I had to check myself a bunch of times. I'm like, dude, doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. And I'm sure there's moments where you're like, dude, this doesn't know what the heck he's talking about.
Yeah.
And then I had to check myself and be like, hang on, like what is founding that presupposition that you have? What is founding that belief that's making your inner voice say that? Yeah. And then it's like, oh, it's just my pride or my hubris because I like this idea or I like whatever. And it's like, okay, well, that's not, that doesn't mean he doesn't know what he's talking about. That means that you just like this thing that you're that he's suggesting be removed. And then it's like 9 times out of 10. Yeah, he's actually right. That's a stupid idea. Okay, go to the next one. And so I think that's the thing about the whole creative process and why it was so awesome to work with you too, is like, I have such massive respect for you and for your like capacity for communication and your just like linguistic prowess, that whenever you made a suggestion about like, well, maybe we should do this way, and I'm like, I don't agree, but let me play it out. And then like usually 9 times out of 10, we'd get like 3 or 4 pages later, and I'm like, oh, he tied that back in. I was like, that was actually really great. And so it's like, I think it's just really hard. It's really hard when you're, starting any new type of venture to like fully let go. But I would say it's like, if you can do that for anybody who's watching and you're just kind of about to start something with someone who you've never worked with before, just remind yourself that you're stupid and that whoever you're working with is probably also stupid, but like collectively you'll get it there if you really wanted to get there. And it comes out great. It's great. I think I honestly, like, this is one of the coolest things that I think I've done in the last, decade. So I'm very excited to get it in people's hands.
Love it.
Yeah.
Speaking of, or Jordan, you can go ahead, but
just real quick. What I was just gonna say is like the thing that, again, as you're thinking about this, like there's like this saying, it's like, if you want to go quickly, go. It's like, if you want to
go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Yeah.
If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's 100% what I've experienced. And I think about this in like Christian denominational terms. Like there's so much, like, it's super easy just to divide and fracture in order to maintain you getting everything you think is right, or everything you think is, what you want to have within a group of people. And yet, like, there's something so beautiful and something much more real and permanent when, again, it's like unity does not come from uniformity, where it's like, this is a real costly unity. Like, us being together and us working together on this, like, it was costly. Like, it cost us time. It cost us, working hard and like spending much more time and energy than it would have if we just would have written this thing by ourselves. But the end product is just going to be, I just think people are going to be really excited and I hope blown away by it.
Yeah. I think it's great. I think, I think the artwork too is just like a constant thing. I'm just like, dude. Yeah, she just nailed it. I remember what you said with the thing, just like, yeah, this is our artist. Karis is great. The stuff is fun. Like the image in the bottom left that you see is actually like, this is Karis's artwork, and it's just, yeah, it's just great. It's all hand drawn too, like no AI. Same with the text, no AI. Like, human fortitude. That's right. Hard fought, hard won. So
that's no AI rhyming. No AI rhyming.
Let's go.
That's all.
Very very difficult.
JM rhyming.
Yeah.
So guys, you guys are in a campaign right now to get this book published, right? And where can people get the book? Where can they get more information about you guys? What are all the links? What are all the downloads?
Scan the QR code.
Yeah, scan the QR code right there on the screen. If you
over here.
for anyone on audio,
for anyone on audio or to the blind, you can go to tou.tgfb.com. And go find it there, and then by
the way, the Braille version is not in this first edition set. So
I was like,
blind, please let us know if you have a good blind artist.
That would be incredible.
But I'm just thinking of Robin Hood Men in Tights now, and Blinken sitting on the. Anyways.
Anyhow, yeah. So you can find it there. We have like a whole bunch of we probably overdid it in terms of offering options. So we've got a paperback version, we've got a normal hardcover, we've got a premium hardcover that's got like sewn bindings and super good quality paper. Then we've got, again, we're working with Lena from the Little Hodler to do like a little Orange Umbrella Man Hodler thing, get like poster prints. We got a whole bunch of things. So the goal is to raise, as of the other day, it was 0.11 Bitcoin. We're over, I think we're like 55% funded. So in only 7 days, we got about 31 days, 32 days left. So would really appreciate your help in getting it across the line.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. We're super stoked.
Yeah. So that's tou.tftg.com.
tou.tgfb.com.
Oh gosh, I messed it up.
You're good.
All right, guys.
TOU, the Orange Umbrella. TGFB, thank God for Bitcoin.com. Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, Jordan, JD, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for the intro. Thanks for all your work in the space. And we will be seeing you around. So
appreciate you, bro. Good to see you,
peace.
JD.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks for tuning in to Better by Bitcoin. Bitcoin makes everything better. Like, subscribe, and follow us on X at BetterBYBTC, YouTube at BetterBYBitcoin. Not financial advice, mathematical certainty.